The year was 1851, and the United States of America, not even 100 years old, was hoping to make a strong impression on the world stage. Not just the proverbial world stage, but a literal one. The United Kingdom was hosting the first true World's Fair. While France had been showcasing its own technology in popular national expositions since 1798, the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations would be the first attempt to bring the world together in the name of unity, diversity, and of course, competition. Inside the beautiful Crystal Palace Exhibition Hall, countries would set up displays of their achievements, hoping to assert dominance over one another in the areas of art and industry. The US in particular was hoping to make an impact among the world powers. At 75 years young, the US was still building a sense of identity and national culture. Despite many European countries looking down on the US, the ingenuity displayed by the country at the fair would legitimately astound its critics. An invention such as a fascinating firearm, a revolver, designed by Samuel Colt, would become some of the highlights of the fair. Many believe that the exposition had two overall winners, obviously the host, the UK, but also the underdog, the US. Feeling confident, the US planned to host their own great exhibition, the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations in New York City just 2 years after London's fair. The exhibition was another success, with the most memorable achievement being Elijah Otis's elevator safety device that would allow for large buildings known as skyscrapers to be built in major cities around the world, some towering as high as 20 stories. Another achievement of the fair was the Ladding Observatory, a 290-foot tall wooden observation tower, which was the tallest structure in New York at the time. Despite the fair's success, the US was still looking for its place in the industrial world, and the country was still trying to develop its culture. And while some would argue that it never fully would, over the next 4 decades, it certainly would achieve one important, all-encompassing, almost abstract idea, an idea that the world would obsess over, a term that companies would tout for over a century, and a concept that would eventually seem to disappear in an instant. It was the promise of tomorrow, it was the optimism toward the future, and it was the idea of progress. On February 6, 1859, in the village of Bluevale in what is now southwest Ontario, Canada, a baby was born in a small pine cabin on a modest farm. The baby boy would belong to the farmer and his wife. It was their first child. As their son would grow, the farmer's work habits translated a clear and powerful lesson. Never be afraid to leave everything behind at a moment's notice to chase an opportunity. In the first few years of his life, the farmer's son would see his father go from a farmer to an oil driller to a farmer again, to a salt miner, and once more back to a farmer. His father might have taught him to chase opportunities, but he certainly didn't instill in his son a good judgment for what a worthwhile opportunity was. After the 1853 fair, world expositions were a dime a dozen, or around $3 a dozen when adjusted for inflation. These fairs were often timed by the countries to celebrate certain historical events. The first significant World's Exposition in the US after the New York Fair was held in 1876 to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The fair, located in Philadelphia, signified progress for the US in terms of national culture and innovation. Another highlight of the Centennial Exposition was the display of the torch-bearing right arm from the soon-to-be-built Statue of Liberty, a France-funded monument with steelwork by French engineer Gustave Eiffel. The very next year at France's 1878 exposition, the head of the sculpture was on display. The Centennial Exposition drew in over 10 million visitors, which makes sense because the fair had the largest fork and knife in the world, but it was not enough to make a profit, which means that someone wasn't charging enough to see the largest fork and knife in the world. It was common for World's Fairs to run at a loss. In fact, many believe that the financial benefits to hosting a fair could not be calculated using ticket sales alone. The US, and every World's Fair host, was acquiring honor, influence, and respect for their country, back when that mattered. In 1877, at the age of 18, the farmer's son left his home in New Jersey, following his father and his brother to California under the lure of the gold rush. But they changed their minds halfway through their journey, settling on a farm in Kansas instead. Less than a decade later, they were moving once again, this time to Florida, accompanied by another family heading in the same direction. The farmer's son, who would work as a mailman in his first few years in Florida, would fall in love with the 16-year-old daughter of the farmers with which he traveled, and he would marry her on New Year's Day in 1888. The farmer's son would then try his hand in farming in Florida, purchasing an orange grove. Around this time in the late 1880s, France was planning another World's Fair, the 1889 Exposition Universelle, to commemorate the centennial of the French Revolution. The exposition was to feature a tower that was 1,000 feet tall, at the urging of Gustave Eiffel. The fair committee asked for ideas from engineers. One concept was to celebrate the anniversary of the French Revolution by constructing a 1,000-foot tall, presumably non-functioning, guillotine. Unfortunately, this idea would not win the hearts of the committee, who instead chose Eiffel's concept of an iron tower, inspired by the Latin Observatory. Designed by two of Eiffel's employees, the Eiffel Tower would be an elegant and powerful structure, towering over Paris. The exposition itself would be a huge success as well, with over 30 million visitors. It was said to be the best attended peaceful event in the history of the world. Many Americans laughed at France's idea of a 1,000-foot tower in Paris, believing it would become an eyesore to the city. But when Eiffel and his associates were able to pull it off with elegance and grace, the US naysayers appeared as fools. Still developing their national culture, the US desperately wanted to display artistic prowess, and what better way to do it than with a fair of their own? Immediately after France's successful exposition, the US began planning their own World's Fair, to be held in 1892, to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing in the New World. Unlike the Centennial Exposition, the US was hoping that the Columbian Exposition would be both an artistic and financial achievement. Chicago was chosen for the location of the fair, bidding slightly higher than New York. In February of 1890, Chicago, the second most populated city in the country, was given little more direction than top the Eiffel Tower. 8 months later, little had developed. The committee was stalled on a number of issues, mainly the fair's location within Chicago. Unfortunately, the stagnation would be the least of the fair's problems. In October of 1890, concerns of a global recession made their way to the United States. If a panic occurred, there was no chance that the fair would be a success. Despite this, the committee would push forward, taking their first big step in electing Chicago architect Daniel Burnham to the fair's chief of construction. Burnham, a well-respected figure in Chicago along with his partner John Root, who would die from pneumonia less than 3 months later, was a fine choice to lead the development of the fair. Burnham would go on to assemble a team of talented designers, demanding that they create the greatest fair in the history of the world. In November, Jackson Park, on the south side of Chicago and on the shore of Lake Michigan, was selected as the location for the fair. Not only would the area provide a beautiful view of the lake, but Jackson Park also included the Midway Plaisance, a mile-long strip of park that was more swampy than it was beautiful. In December 1890, Burnham had developed a rough map for the fair, including a mile-long pleasure garden for the Midway, which was to include displays of both education and amusement. Burnham also left an empty space for the fair's tower, which had still not developed past its initial concept of the Eiffel Tower, but better. A few months later, the Westinghouse Company was hired to provide electricity to the fair, bidding just below the Edison General Electric Company, a company that was a year away from a merger that would transform them into General Electric. The fair planned to have an electricity building, with inventions and innovations from Edison and Tesla. Guests would be amazed by the innovations to the incandescent lamps and electric lights, which meant no more kerosene and no more gas. The farmer's son, now a farmer himself with his orange grove in Florida, was failing just as his father had. A freeze had destroyed many of his newly acquired crops. As his father had uprooted his family to pursue uncertain opportunities, the farmer's son was about to do the same. With his first child on the way, the farmer's son would travel once again, this time to Chicago, hoping to secure employment as a carpenter. There would be plenty of construction with the World's Fair, and the carpenter hoped to establish his family in the Illinois city. With a newly born son and now a second child on the way, the farmer's son and his wife arrived in Chicago in 1890. In the summer of 1891, construction began on the first of the fair's main exhibition buildings. There were to be 14 great buildings, each with a different industry represented, such as the Fisheries Building, the Forestry Building, the Mines and Mining Building, the Agricultural Building, and the Horticultural Building, among others. There was also a cold storage building built by Hercules Ironworks and the ice and refrigeration machine manufacturers. The companies would show off their advancements in refrigeration technologies with their new ice boxes, some holding 50 pounds of ice, resulting in milk not souring as quick as it used to. Despite the building's purpose as a showcase of ice coolers, it would briefly catch fire during its operation. The construction of the fair continued. The dedication was scheduled for October 1892, and the opening was scheduled for May 1893, but weather and construction issues had been constantly plaguing development. Worse, now in the summer of 1891, there was still no Eiffel Tower challenger. The nation's leading architects and engineers were not stepping up to the plate. It seemed that the fair's placement in Chicago had disinterested many of the top minds of the Northeast, and Burnham was furious. The local Chicago newspaper, the Tribune, even put out a competition urging for ideas that could best Eiffel, and best they would, if the submissions were at all plausible. One suggestion was for a telescopic tower that would raise in intervals over a long period of time, with a restaurant on top with incredible views. A proposed 9,000-foot tall tower with a 1,000-foot base built 2,000 feet into the ground was suggested by the Toboggan Transportation Company. The engineers proposed multiple toboggan lines that guests could take for fast travels to cities such as New York and Boston. Not to entertain this ridiculous concept too much, but a passenger sledding from the top of the 9,000-foot tall tower located in Chicago all the way to New York at Olympic toboggan speeds would take 10 hours. What one would do after arriving in the new city with only the possessions they could fit inside the toboggan with no mode of transportation back is unclear. A less impossible, but more dangerous idea was a 4,000-foot tall tower with 2,000-foot cables attached to giant passenger cars. These cars would be thrown off of the tower with guests inside, and would be stopped by the elastic cable, bouncing them to a halt. This predated the sport of bungee jumping by about a century, but just because something was ahead of its time does not automatically mean that it was good. The engineer of the Death Tower clarified that there would need to be at least 8 feet of feathers at the bottom in case the cable snapped, a courteous precaution that would have saved absolutely no one. Gustave Eiffel himself even contacted the exposition committee, offering his services in helping them defeat himself. This was one of the luckiest moments for Burnham and fair organizers. While they did not hire Eiffel, the news that he would possibly be designing the fair's flagship attraction angered the architects and engineers that were previously unconcerned of the fair's development. The committee kindly turned Eiffel down and began to field more serious and practical submissions from American engineers. In April of 1892, Burnham and fair designers made what would be the boldest decision that they would make. The majority of the buildings at the fair were to be painted white. This would result in a gorgeous neoclassic look to the exposition, which would soon be referred to as the White City. While opposed by the modern architects of the time, the fair would be beautiful and would help the US to be seen as an artistic force. While the White City that was the fair would be organized, clean, and safe, the rest of Chicago would be given the name the Black City, mostly for its poor sanitation and its billowing smoke. Chicago was seen as a dangerous place, the most dangerous in the country. In the first half of 1892, almost 800 murders occurred in the city. Yet its danger was romanticized, glorified. It was exciting. Even with violent crime and dirty streets, Chicago was a place to be. Burnham would gather architects and engineers in a type of think tank to determine the fair's signature attraction. At one of these meetings, a young engineer, just over 30 years old, listened to Burnham's pleas for an attraction. He was motivated to pitch a concept, and he developed an idea that he had been considering for years: a large steel spinning wheel. The man's name was George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. approached the committee about his idea for an Eiffel wheel. The committee wasn't convinced, but after many trusted engineers backed the proposal, they conceded and allowed Ferris's wheel to be built, to be placed in the middle of the fair's midway. The fair would take in 50% of the profits from the wheel after the first $300,000. The agreement was made in December of 1892, 2 months after the fair's dedication and a mere 5 months before its opening. In March of 1893, the wheel's iron axle, weighing nearly 45 tons and forged in Pittsburgh, arrived in Chicago. It was miraculously lifted and placed on the supports, as the engines for the wheel were still being constructed over 200 yards away, and the wheel itself was still not complete. While Burnham and the fair organizers were in a panic over the impending opening of the fair, the United States as a whole was in a panic over the economy. A variety of factors, including overinvestment in the railroads, which had been very good for the fair, had caused a deep economic recession, which would be very bad for the fair. In times of economic uncertainty, the first thing cut from a family's budget would be travel and leisure spending. The fair was relying on people, not just from the US, but from around the world to attend. Despite the stress of the economy, Burnham pushed on, employing around 20,000 workers in April of 1893 to have the fair ready for the May 1st opening, one of them being the farmer's son, now settled in Chicago with his family and working on the fair. Work conditions were dangerous, and many deaths occurred due to accidents. Despite the chaos of construction, Chicago was excited for the fair. It was time for their city to shine, and newspapers reported on many of the fair's exhibitions and attractions, including displays on the Midway and a quickly built World's Fair hotel. Everyone seemed to be disappointed that Ferris's wheel would not be open for the big day. but Burnham was focused on delayed matters as simple as painting the buildings. On May 1st, 1893, with Burnham, the fair's organizers, the engineers, President Grover Cleveland, and even the builders still constructing it, the World's Columbian Exposition opened to the public. Hundreds of thousands of people flooded in. Some estimates claim that nearly 500,000 entered Jackson Park that day. Guests viewed the many grand exhibits and walked up and down the midway. Small recreations of countries were present, such as a street in Cairo that featured a show of a belly dancer doing a dance that was commonly referred to as the Hoochie Coochie, with an accompanying tune, supposedly improvised by one of the fair's organizers. Guests could go near the lake and walk on a new invention, the Travelator, or as it would later become known, a moving walkway. A man named Whitcomb Judson found a way to fasten two pieces of fabric together with a metal device called a clasp locker. It would later develop into the popular fashion device, the zipper. Also on display was an electric kitchen oven controlled by thermostat, although it was unfortunately still not able to clean itself. Guests would be able to collect the first ever elongated coins, later known as a pressed penny. These would quickly become collector's items at similar amusement-type fairs. Other, more regrettable inclusions on the Midway were a series of native villages, later referred to as human zoos, in which people from far-off places such as Indonesia and West Africa would reside in an exhibit supposed to appear similar to their own native villages. Just nearby that, visitors would be able to ride Thomas Rankin's Snow and Ice Railway, a bobsled ride where guests would race around a track, one precursor to the roller coasters that would soon populate the country. The fun ride would be criticized after a sled flew off of the track, resulting in the death of a passenger. Guests were also able to try new delicacies, such as a new snack named a Cracker Jack, a new gum called a Juicy Fruit, and a new breakfast cereal called Shredded Wheat. Finally, a patriotic, almost creepy poem recited by school children named the Pledge of Allegiance would debut. With hundreds of thousands of people roaming the fairgrounds, it seemed that the fair would be a huge success, and Chicago was well on its way to topping Paris. The very next day, only 10,000 people showed up to the fair. 3 days later, many major banks in Chicago began to close as the economic recession reached the city. Only 3,000 visitors a day entered the fair at the end of May. The recession worsened, and crowds continued to fall. Burnham and the other architects were no longer concerned of beating Paris. They were just hoping that the fair wouldn't be one of, if not the greatest failed event in the history of the world. Worse, right next door, showman Buffalo Bill Cody had brought his popular Wild West show to Chicago and had parked it right next to the exposition. The fair had denied his request to be part of the festivities, so as Buffalo Bill drew tens of thousands of people, the fair received no part of the profits. In June of 1893, Ferris's wheel was tested without cars. Shortly after, the cars were hung. On June 11th, Burnham and Ferris's wife tested the ride, and 2 days later, the press were allowed to experience the wheel. The ride was huge, 264 feet tall with 36 cars weighing 13 tons each of which could hold 60 people, with seating for 38. Excitement was high for the wheel, but it was hurting the fair. Many people refused to make the trip to Chicago until after the main attraction was open, not wanting to waste their time or money on an incomplete land, or fair rather. Miraculously, Ferris was able to get his monstrosity of steel moving and ready for guests. On June 21st, Ferris opened his attraction, and attendance at the fair boosted significantly. Many were quick to point out that the low attendance in the first 2 months of the fair could have been avoided if the land, or fair, would have opened as a cohesive unit. Guests were slightly underwhelmed by the wheel at first, expecting it to be thrilling or dangerous. However, it was serene and beautiful, and guests quickly became entranced in its wonder. Only on a few instances did claustrophobic guests or riders that were afraid of heights cause a panic and try to jump off the ride. All of these attempts were thwarted by placing a fair attendant in each car. Many couples wanted to get married at the top of the wheel, inviting entire wedding parties without permission from the fair's organizers, who denied them access and married them in offices instead. The wheel operated for the next 4 months of the fair, pulling in 1.5 million visitors, earning over $700,000 with Ferris's company profiting nearly $400,000. Despite this, Ferris claimed he did not receive all of the profits owed to him. He soon faced bankruptcy, and his wife left him. The Columbian Exposition would end as a success, and its Chicago Day celebration on October 9, 1893, would bring in over 700,000 guests to the fair, beating Paris's single-day record by over 300,000 visitors. This put the fair in the black, cementing it as a financial success, and the beauty and grace of the White City would cement it as an artistic success as well. The fair's achievements would be slightly overshadowed, as it was revealed that the owner of the hotel referred to as the World's Fair Hotel had turned out to be a new kind of killer, a serial killer, murdering many of the residents of the inn. The US now had its own Jack the Ripper, and the danger of Chicago that had once been romanticized was now feared. The country was shook by the details of the murders of H.H. Holmes. At the same time the U.S. was trying to build its national culture, its innocence was slipping away quickly. After the fair, the farmer's son continued his career as a carpenter, building and selling homes, and even constructing the St. Paul Congregational Church for his friend and preacher Walter Parr. It seemed that he had finally found a sustainable profession, something his father never could. 6 months after the Columbian Exposition closed, Ferris's wheel would be moved near Lincoln Park on the north side of Chicago. The move would take 86 days and cost $15,000, or around $400,000 today. In July 1895, the wheel was reconstructed, and by October, it was running once again. George Ferris would see the beginning of an unsuccessful second run for his creation, before dying of typhoid fever in 1896, at the young age of 37. His legacy would be strong, as he had created a new type of amusement ride, one that would bear his name and would become a staple of fairs and parks for decades and centuries to come. Even the midway that his wheel was placed would become a common term and design element of the amusement parks that would follow. Despite all of his contributions, perhaps his greatest achievement came in 1900, when Paris held their first exposition since their 1889 fair. The exposition featured Paris's own Great Wheel, a near replica of Ferris's. Ferris had taken on Eiffel, and now Paris was taking on him. The wheel Ferris built for the Chicago Fair would be moved once again, where it would entertain guests at the 1904 St. Louis Exposition, celebrating the anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. This would not be the only reoccurring attraction from the Columbian Exposition, as another Little Egypt show would see the return of the Hoochie Coochie. The St. Louis Exposition would end on December 1st, 1904. The wheel sat still for a year and a half, before on May 11th, 1906, after stripping it of its valuable parts, Ferris's creation was destroyed in the most graceful, respectful, and safe way that a wheel of its size could be. It was blown to bits by 300 pounds of dynamite. In total, over 2.5 million people had been entertained by the attraction, and many knockoffs would soon be built throughout the world, increasing the prominence of the Ferris wheel. The United States had sought respect for its art from the world with the fair and the wheel, and in doing so, might have contributed to their national culture more than the fair organizers realized. Unlike the Eiffel Tower, the US had not constructed a beautiful sculpture of steel, with grace and elegance that could stand in Paris and fit. They had created a ride, an amusement ride. The country was still young, but they had proven their industry and art through the fairs of the past half-century. But Ferris's wheel might have been the greatest display of what would soon become a key part of America's culture: excess, thrill, and amusement. And for better or for worse, that's progress. The farmer's son's family now consisted of 5 children. The exposition had led to a prosperous career in Chicago, so much that he suggested to his wife that they name their third son Columbus, after the Columbian Exposition. She wasn't thrilled about the name, and the couple decided on the name Roy for their third child instead. The farmer's son wouldn't raise the issue again with their fourth child, choosing to name him after his friend Walter Parr, although they would refer to him as simply Walt. In 1906, the farmer's son decided it was time to move his family out of Chicago. The rise in crime in the city had finally gotten to him, so the farmer's son, Elias, and his family packed their bags and headed for Marceline, Missouri.